Hello everybody, welcome back to Screenstars and welcome to another classic Chuck Norris review. Today I'm taking a look at the 1984 film Missing in Action. The film is directed by Joseph Zito and stars of course Chuck Norris. We have Emmett Walsh, David Tress and Leonore Kasdorf and James Hong. Now the film focuses on, it's set in 1984, some years after the Vietnam War. Chuck Norris plays Colonel James Braddock, who is suffering after the Vietnam War. He's a veteran of the war, he's an ex-POW as well, prisoner of war. And he is invited back to Singapore, is it? Saigon, sorry. To kind of... the Vietnam government, if you like, are trying to cover up the fact that there are POWs over there. So they invite people back to make it a political event. Braddock's invited back, as well as some prominent politicians from the US, so on and so forth. And he doesn't buy any of it, basically. He knows it's a lot of bull. He knows there's POWs in Vietnam. But secretly, while there, he plans an operation to head into Vietnam, find some POWs and bring them back and provide proof. Right, what are my thoughts on Missing in Action? Well, as Chuck Norris films go, many regard this, or the trilogy of Missing in Action films, as kind of some of his best. Now, I'll be honest, when I grew up, the main Chuck Norris films that I watched was like Invasion USA and things like that. I never really bothered with the Missing in Action films an awful lot when I was young. I don't actually think I've even seen the third one. But because I think mainly because when I was young, I wasn't necessarily that interested in war films and things like that. I think the only war film I used to watch, it's not a war film, but the only film I used to watch when I was young that was related to Vietnam was like Rambo First Blood Part 2, which ironically, I believe that Stallone took the idea of Rambo First Blood Part 2 to Canon, and they kind of realised it was going to be too expensive sort of thing and passed on the project. But they kind of jumped the gun and kind of moved forward with the idea with Chuck Norris for this film, Missing in Action, because the two films, you know, are unavoidably very, very similar. And that essentially is the reason why they decided to go and make a cheaper version of it, if you like, Canon films. And that's what we get here, really, with this film. It's like a cheaper, less explosiony version of Rambo First Blood Part 2 without Stallone. You've got Chuck Norris instead. Now, that's unkind, really. They're not very similar films at all in many, many ways. If you want a pure action film, you know, it's Rambo for First Blood Part 2. If you want an action film with a little bit more thought process put into it, I suppose, you probably will prefer this one, because this, in actual fact, takes quite a long time to get going. He spends quite a lot of time, like I say, is in Saigon, kind of, you know, doing his inquiries and this, that, and the other. And so it's quite a long setup. I think it might even be maybe about an hour or close to an hour before he even sets foot in Vietnam to get these POWs. Much of it, like I say, is getting his supplies and making his connections and so on and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily mean there's no action for an hour. There are moments where there are actions. You know, there's a nice piece on the pier where he's driving along in his truck and he's being chased, because kind of the Vietnam government kind of know what he's up to and they know he's a bit of a threat, so they kind of have people tailing him all the time and stuff. So there's constantly like assassins trying to take him out because they know how much of a threat he is. So you see Chuck Norris kind of avoiding this all the time, sort of thing, while this is going on. And then he gets into Vietnam and he's supported by Emmett Walsh, who's like an old war buddy. And they've got all the gear and they head into Vietnam and he does what he does, which is, you know, being awesome, of course, because he's Chuck Norris. Now, also as well, my understanding is that this was filmed exactly the same time as Missing in Action 2. And also my understanding is, because Missing in Action 2, the beginning is kind of him in Vietnam before this film. And that was, pardon me, because I've got a bit of a cold, guys, you'll have to forgive me. But so the second film was in actual fact supposed to be the first film. And then this one, Mission in Action, was supposed to be the sequel. But they realised apparently when they'd finished filming that this one, Missing in Action, which should have been the second one, if that makes sense, was a stronger film. So they wanted to release this one first, and then the second one would kind of be a prequel sort of thing. So that was quite an interesting thing that they did there. But I think as far as Canon really in the 80s, they were a bit hit and miss. I mean, obviously it's Canon, but they were legendary really in the 80s. I mean, they came up with some brilliant films, and they certainly threw quite a bit of money at some of the films that they put into production, and this is certainly one of them. There's some good gun battles, there's some good explosions. It doesn't look or feel cheap at all. But I suppose in comparison to something like Rambo First Blood Part 2, you can certainly see the differences in the budget. But I don't think there's a major difference here in either of these films in regards to quality. You know what I mean? They are both different films, though. Apparently Jean-Claude Van Damme was one of the stuntmen as well on this film. I think it was one of his first credits, because he did quite a bit of stunt performance before because he was famously in The Predator as well. Van Damme, he was going to play the Predator until they realised that design was terrible, and then they changed it, and Kevin Peter Hall came in. Interestingly as well, at the beginning of the film, you see Braddock watching SpiderMan the cartoon on the TV set, and that was because, believe it or not, Canon was supposed to make a Spider-Man film in the 80s or the early 90s. They had taken over the rights from Marvel, I think it was, something like that. So they had the rights to do a Spider-Man film, but it never came to fruition. Thank the Lord. Could you imagine a Canon Spider-Man film? So that's why they could show Spider-Man on the TV at the beginning, because they had the rights to show it and that kind of stuff. So I think this is a solid Chuck Norris film. I don't think, for me personally, it's not right up there with my favourites, but it's certainly well made, and is some good action in it. And I will obviously get round to reviewing Missing in Action 2 and the third one as well as many more great Chuck Norris films. So thank you very much for watching, everybody.